Welcome to Another Education is Possible, a podcast about education's radical potential. I'm your host, Jordan Corson. Today's going to be a bit of a different episode. For the first time, we're not actually having a guest. Instead, my producers, Yardain and Samantha Haley, join me for a bit of a check-in. This isn't exactly a state of the podcast. It's not a halfway point check-in. We're actually a little bit beyond halfway through our first season here. Instead, we pause in this moment as is so essential to education. And we pause in this moment in particular because we recorded this amidst a week in which Colombia capitulated to the demands of the Trump administration, when Mahmoud Khalil had been kidnapped, and when Israel resumed its genocidal assault on Gaza. And we pause to ask ourselves a question about what we're doing here, what a podcast does in this moment. So let's listen in to this brief conversation where Sam, Yardain, and I ask ourselves that very question. I'm here with Sam and Yardain, our producers. Hey, everybody.
Hey.
Hey. So, I'd love to do some reviewing and seeing where things are, but I thought maybe I'd start with what do we hope this is for? Because I think all three of us have, been pretty committed to this, and at the same time, it's never our priority because it can't be, right? We all have work, we all have activism, and we all have lives, and this seems to fall, somewhere within that mix. I often get to the podcast after I teach, do grading, do service, do research and writing, go to a rally, attend organizing meetings, and then sit down on the podcast. And yet I hope for something with that. I hope that we're offering some kind of connection for anti-Zionist Jews to build community and new understandings of their work.
One of my big hopes for the podcast is like having it be an alternative source of education. Not everybody is able to get a university education. And like, as we've seen, people receiving it are facing like significant struggles in advocating for what they believe in and like a free Palestine, and subsequently being denied like their right to pursue an education. So for me, I see it as like another facet of life where you can get a more non-traditional form of education and start this process of communicating with others and understanding what collective action or solidarity may look like for different individuals in a diverse array of like situations. And I think that's a part of activism that is really neglected in the United States is like the communal part. There's such like a neoliberal individualistic ideal that is ground into us from like the beginning of our lives, that it's hard for us to imagine what that collective looks like. And I think that conversations like this give a space where people can contemplate what those like collective spheres would look like in their world, and how they can do like smaller acts to bring people together. I think we focus a lot on larger acts of solidarity and resistance, and those are also really important. But fundamentally, we need to have the local, like communal connections to keep the resistance going and to like inspire and help each other survive and maintain those like coalitions. So I see the podcast as like one piece of the puzzle where we're trying to solve these bigger issues of what do we do like in a fascist nation, and how do we interrogate anti-Zionism, how or not anti-Zionism, Zionism. How do we interrogate Zionism, and how do we work towards a free Palestine? Like, what are the resources at our disposal?
That's really well said, Sam. And I think another angle maybe what I see as another really essential piece of the political project of this and other kinds of podcast shows right now that are particularly focused on Israel-Palestine in relation to education is right now we're seeing um, a, a really intense move by um, a block of the right and the center, right? The liberals sort of to redefine or further sediment, maybe if we want to say it's already been defined like this for a long time, what is considered Jewish, what is considered a proper Jew, um, and um, I think that, you know, it is essential as they continue to try and police what is proper and improper surrounding at this moment where they're trying to define what is a good Jew and what is a bad Jew. It's essential that we create more and platform more stories of that challenge that sort of discourse, because um, you can see what we can see right now what happens down the slippery slope of a good bad sort of narrative.
Yeah, bringing kind of what the two of you said together, I think. I mean, first off, Yardain, it's been a joy and an honor to be a bad Jew with you during this
Yeah.
podcast. I think, um, that is a big goal here, right? Is to build community and um, and navigate this world among a diversity of Judaism. And I think I will say, like in the over a year that I've been studying this, I've been, I guess you could say, I've been anti-Zionist for 15 years. Since we recorded this first episode with Raz, and then recording the end of last summer with Saul, I've learned more about Judaism, and I've seen more types of Jews than I had in decades. And I've learned how dynamic and geographically, ideologically, racially diverse Judaism is, and that has been amazing. And it has been a real place to gather and build community. I also know that a big concern throughout this podcast has been what it means to center Jewish voices, even if we say we are centering Jewish voices insofar as they can be of service to Palestinian liberation. But what it means to, we're recording among the three of us partially because this week has been really like in 17 months of horror. Um, this has been just unimaginable on top of just the nightmare that has been going on. And between Mahmoud Khalil's kidnapping, multiple people have now been kidnapped. Israel just decides, I mean, they're already starving Gazans and then just decide to kill hundreds of people and create a full-on onslaught. And, I'm not saying, oh, we're doing something bad, or I'm saying, like, let's just try to excuse ourselves by talking about it. But I am really left wondering what it means to do these deep interviews with Jewish folks at a time like this.
I think that's something that I've been grappling with a lot as well. One of the hardest things about like the current political situation we have in the United States is like the polarization and how deeply entrenched certain values are in people. And I think platforming Jewish voices and demonstrating the transformation that can happen to shift one's perspective and move towards like an anti-Zionist platform can be a really important and powerful point of connection for people who would be altogether dismissive of Palestinian voices. And so I see it as a stepping stone in a way of like building a framework of recognition. Like if you can learn from these other people how to shift your perspective, then perhaps you'll be more adherent to when you listen, like when you listen to these Palestinian voices, instead of automatically framing everything within this very polarized emotional mindset that doesn't want to critically interrogate like where that anger or frustration is coming from. And so it does privilege Jewish voices and center them instead of like Palestinian voices, which like is an ethical dilemma.
I think it was our guest Joe Feinberg who talked about, since this is being done in our name, we do as Jews have to respond. I think not to plug anything on on a podcast I'm part of already, but I have an academic article hopefully coming out soon where part of it I flip Edward Said's famous essay, Zionism from the standpoint of its victims, and talk about anti-Zionism from the standpoint of its educational subjects, and think about how we are always, as Jews, the people who it's like, this is for us. This genocide is done in our name, with our particularly being in the heart of empire here, in the United States. This is done for us. So I do think there is a need for Jews to be super vocal and to be putting their voices and bodies out there, not speaking over anyone, but certainly participating and acting in solidarity.
I really love what both of you said, and I think maybe this is just where I'm at personally, but I think I also want to just make sure that, you know, at least I'm not sugarcoating any sort of this horror with, just we have to the little bit that we can do is enough, or this sort of um, uh, project, as long as we reach one listener is enough. Like, I think that I just want to name that the horror, like the experience of it, especially in the heart of empire, I think breeds with like a real cognitive dissonance and like cliff of nihilism and negativity that and paralysis, I think, or at least the feeling of paralysis and like Sam, neoliberal sort of individualized paralysis, at least for me, but I don't think that I'm unique. And I think that experience, naming it, is both banal in 2025 and also important, because I think there's an easy way of sort of just like, you know, kind of bypassing into a hope that we're all just trying to remain and do what we can. And I think that that's all true. But I think I just like feel compelled to like name how hard. And even as I say this, I'm like, what right do I have to like say how fucking hard it is for me to be here in the United States, right? Like while all this is going on, and that guilt simultaneously then gets refracted as, okay, that's not helpful, right? Like all these sorts of like twists and turns that happen, I think, in my mind multiple times a day. Um, and I think where I started, just to end, like I want to be careful in saying all of that, not just to like bum people out or bum myself out more, as much as to like name that like that is part of the experience that I think this project and projects like it in very small ways are trying to resist, because I think it is paralysis, the paralysis of consumption in particular for me, that really makes living through a genocide like this, from where I am, difficult, because I just don't feel like I have anything useful to do. And yet, like, I agree with you. Some of the meetings, some of these folk, like, I have learned so much about worlds of Judaism, like that I never thought or knew even existed, over the past months. And that learning is a little thing that, you know, is a seed of something and is relevant towards liberation. Like, and it's not tomorrow, and it is tomorrow.
That reminds me of the book Emergent Strategy by Adrienne Marie Brown. Absolutely incredible book. And you can also get it for free online. It's completely accessible, which is really great. But like showing how important it is at like attacking these structures from multiple levels. So like the local, national, like state, how all of those are really important. And so I think like I was saying, like this is a small piece of the puzzle. Like there are other things that we should, you know, try to be doing like when we can, but like realistically, not everybody has the safety to um like move in these waves of mass resistance that we idealize. And like thinking about the Holocaust, for example, like nowadays when we look back, we're like, why didn't everyday people resist this? And now that we're like in a very similar situation, it's like because there are so many more like complications and intersections in people's lives that make it difficult. And we want to have this like heroic notion that we would be different. But in reality, like we do have like a limited amount, but we have to interrogate what those limits are and if they're limits that like we're putting on ourselves that are like to keep ourselves safe, or if they're limits that we're putting on ourselves like because we're like scared and or because we don't know what to do and so we don't really want to interrogate anything further, more so like acting in a performative manner. And so I think like this podcast has helped. Like I'm not religious, very non-secular person. And I think showing the diversity of Jewish perspectives, like as Yardain was saying, really helps tackle this idea of like a monolithic like Jewishness and Jewish identity. Because in like the US, it's really taken for granted how like Christianity, like all the different denominations and whatnot, like there's an understanding of those differences. And there's no clear understanding of differences within Judaism or Islam or any of these other religions. And so even just showing those differences to people who are not Jewish and demonstrating a larger like cultural and like religious understanding in that manner, I think is like one piece of the puzzle. Like as Yardain was saying, not everything we're doing is going to have like those most like radical impacts immediately, but then we need to like I think these types of things create a lasting memory and understanding in people that will continue on like through generations and help build like a more resistant like collective of people in the future.
Yeah, I hope so, and I'm careful to say this, but I do think, you know, the last 17 months have in every way been the worst possible hellscape that anyone could ever imagine. And as a number of our guests have said, there has been an awakening that somewhat, as you said, Yardain, provides this hopefulness that a tomorrow will be different. Some form of, we're approaching Passover, next year, and liberation, maybe some possibility. I'd love to go back to this issue that you were mentioning about the balance of hope and not hopelessness, but kind of this flattening of every feeling. I'm not sure if it was the idea of I you know, I know a lot of people have mentioned this idea of like a work genocide balance. Right. So I know for me, I in November of 2023 would be in my office looking at dead children that, dead Palestinian children that Israel had murdered, and then would look up at the time and say, oh, it's time to go teach. And I'm just expected to go about my life now. And the students in my classroom are expected to do the same. And people throughout the world are expected to just move along as if things are going. And the same thing happens. I have about an hour long drive when I'm on campus 2 days a week, and I try to pick out, either moving fiction to listen to or, powerful. There's so many great podcasts out there, and I really try to listen to so many. And at some point, it just becomes content, and I don't always feel moved. I don't always feel the connection that I'm hoping for.
Yeah, I like as a student in the Masters of like Holocaust and Genocide Studies, like there's not really a break from reading about and interrogating like atrocity. And I think it can be really hard to like draw a line and decide like when to take a break, because these issues are all so important, but realistically, we cannot parcel ourselves out and do service to each of them. Like if we try to split ourselves into like that many pieces, like it's going to be insignificant. And so I try to take the perspective, like thinking of like Sarah Ahmed, like the feminist killjoy, and the idea that like you can find happiness in these horrific like situations in discovering ways to like form connections and interrogate them, and like hopefully like produce some sort of right or some sort of step in the right direction. And so having like moments of reflection like at night has been important for me, like giving myself like 30 minutes to an hour to just kind of sit with my own thoughts and journal to figure out like what even is on my mind, because we are exposed to so much media and information, and it's an intentional strategy too from the government to like overwhelm people as much as they possibly can, so then we feel that paralysis and we don't respond accordingly. And so I think it's important to like getting out of that paralysis to like identify the areas where you can help or like be most effective and like work through those. And I think trying to liberate yourself from that is a constant task, but it's really important in realizing or like in being able to act as opposed to being paralyzed. I don't know if that answers the question either. I feel like I
Yeah.
was rambling a bit, but
Yeah. I think there's a real both of both of you are hitting on something about the temporal quality of all of this, right? There's a real notion to bring it back to education. Where education happens is in those breaks, in those moments of pause, and that dynamic between act and reflect and think and do. And many, many great books to recommend. All of this is, of course, coming from capitalism. And probably mentioned this somewhere on the podcast. Our most recent guest, Danny Friedrich, my first year of grad school, recommended this book, 24/7 Capitalism and the Ends of Sleep, about how the forces of capitalism drive us to produce and produce and produce, never rest, always be producing. Every moment is about production and it's never about rest. And I think that that's important educationally. But back to the framing that I even asked this on, you're not supposed to encounter death and keep moving. It's supposed to stop you. Um, you are, I, I don't think anybody should be looking at the massacre of Palestinians and doing anything but stopping in their tracks. And yet, the gear, I don't want to make it too vague. It's not the gears of the system, it's Israel and Zionism and the United States and the US government, um, and the corporations that are funding this mass murder, this ongoing, relentless genocide, want nothing but constant movement and moving along this path. And maybe I'm jumping us ahead, but I think that this is a point to ask a little bit more about the podcast, because one of the things I thought about here was the role that this plays in timeliness. A lot of, like Yardain suggested at some point, everybody's got a fucking podcast. Everybody's got a hot take. And in a way, there's no escaping it. Like, we're doing the same thing because we have our own podcast here. But in a way, when I thought about this, I wanted it to be intentionally slow and intentionally out of step with kind of the urgency and the content consumption. And, rather than everybody having an 800-word op-ed that basically boils down to like, here's my hot take on the issue. It's, let's listen methodically to, even if we, those hot takes are sometimes very important, but behind them, there's an entire life. There's education that has happened over decades guiding somebody to that position. From the every episode is just full of this. I mean, again, I don't want to deviate ourselves, but so many of the people that we've interviewed, I'm like, you're just a cool person. I want to hang out with you. I want to like get to know you more. But it's also just seeing one profound aspect of their lives played out over a long period of time. But often that finds us in this untimely way, existing when there's urgency necessary, right? We're talking about, well, tell us about your formal education and your non-formal education when you're growing up in this area of the world in the 1990s and the 1980s. I don't know. We've had a range of guests of a range of ages, but decades ago when you were growing up in this place, what did school look like for you? And then contrasting that with the direct, hey, there are hundreds of people dying every day, and we need to confront that and get in the face of the forces doing that. So I don't know. There's this real like, I like the untimeliness. I think that's just something I'm wondering about. How are we approaching this season if the idea is educational biography, and that asks us to move methodically, and maybe a methodical response is not what's needed right now.
I mean, I think that teaching people how to move slower, like through the world and through like exploring like other people's lives, stories, educations is important because given like our access to technology and how everything is immediate, um, people aren't learning how to tackle things slower, if that makes sense. Like there's people latch on a lot to like immediate gratification or things that will like immediately solve an issue. But realistically, movements take time and a lot of effort, and to sustain them, like you need those, like you need the fast work, but you also need like those slower critiques and engagements.
I'm very happy to say we have folks who have both reached out to me and said kind of the two things that I was hoping for. One, I have unthought my Zionism and I am making moves to challenge that settler colonial thing. Maybe they're not using the word settler colony, but they're on a path that will eventually get them um, to move towards liberation. And two, like both of you said, there are people who are saying, I'm building community with other anti-Zionists, and this is a space to do that. It's cool to have small but dedicated folks engage with that. So I have one more question. I know yeah, I'm gonna ask one more thing of us all. So this is a very podcasty move and maybe not in line with what we were hoping for with this, but we've got a few months left from our loose timeline that we all laid out, and we have some teachers, some writers, some religious folks lined up. We have some big ideas for what to do with the rest of this podcast in terms of who's on. But do you all have any ideas of like what you're hoping for, both from the obviously it's going to be unpredictable and limiting, but what are you hoping for?
Like I guess my hope is like introducing more perspectives for people to interrogate that don't, because we've worked with like various organizations and like people from those, and they all have different approaches when it comes to like their own activism and work. And I think exploring more of those perspectives shows both like me, but then like other people, like different options that are available and that are out there, that they may not have considered or that might cater to like their interests more. Um, and like, cause like, for example, like Holocaust and genocide studies, like I discovered the master's program by accident because I was doing like research on human rights programs, and it came up and then it just kind of clicked. And I think like the more like perspectives that you showcase and give people, like gives them a chance to kind of have that like click moment, or to have a realization of like this is something where I have like expertise or knowledge in this area or a capacity to do something. And so in that way it can kind of give hope and like more options for people who feel like hopeless or don't know like what part they can play in like this movement.
Maybe one thing that I just that's in theme with, you know, a lot of what we've been talking about that is both personal but also very much collective is, you know, this tension that we're circling around, I don't know, the terrible metaphor of, you know, getting blackpilled or, you know, becoming a nihilist or just whatever form of paralysis, you know, takes you over, and fighting that sort of as a responsibility that we have, you know, for sure. But the tension of that and hope and personally, the work of this show is one piece of a few things that I have in my life that keep me going. Um, you know, that make me feel that I'm not just uh, literally that I've not just become the feed, right? Like that, yeah, and I think the biggest one for me is, serendipitously, I've have fallen into organizing my workplace. And that was totally unexpected. Like nothing that I've done close to that. I've never been like I dabbled in tenant organizing years ago, but this is like serious organizing with stakes that are, yes, very small compared to anything that's going on in the world. But I'll say that we know these kinds, and I know at least that this organizing with the small unit that I'm in is the most grounding form of connective politics and action that I've felt in my life since, I should say, all of the the protests that broke out, right after the genocide began, back in 2023 that I was going to. That was the last thing that like really made me feel like, okay, like we're doing something. We're like I'm together with a group of people, and then those like died out, and I wasn't involved in any sort of group. And then serendipitously have now found myself in this kind of work. And I think I just bring that up because for when I look at myself reflectively, despite all of that and how, you know, depressed I still nonetheless feel, and like hopeless I feel a lot of the time, I think it's worth remembering like this kind of activity, whatever kind of organizing you might be able to touch, like you have no idea. I have no idea where it might lead. And anyone that thinks that they know that this is just a drop in the bucket doesn't understand, including myself, the history of of liberation and like revolution and um uh you know different kinds of protests and how they are sparked. And yeah, I think it's like a reminder like for myself that like what some kind of small act can do, the idea that I know what its capacity is, especially when it is connected with other people, I need to be humble to the fact that I do not know. And that it is my responsibility to just keep trying to put my feet in that space.
That's beautiful. That's a amazing. Actually, that's horrible. That's horrifying, but it's so necessary at this moment. And I think that's a perfect place to end. That maybe we don't know. And that's the beauty of education itself, right? We don't know where it leads. We don't know how, of course, it's not magical. It's not like liberation emerges out of nothing, right? You're doing organizing work, which has a deep and specific history. Um, and solidarity as you continue engaging in negotiations. But to think that perhaps this podcast plays one small part as people are exhausted and keep studying and struggling and pushing toward another world. I think that's what we can hope for at this moment. Thanks as always for listening. If you like our podcast, please follow us on Instagram at another ed as possible. Please rate and subscribe to our podcast wherever you listen. As always, we are encouraging folks to give to any Gaza mutual aid campaign. We'll share more info on our Instagram page. Today's episode is produced by all of us who you heard today, and we'll be back soon with a new episode of Another Education as Possible.